I'm going to be speaking a bit about my dissertation project, which is on understanding and facilitating belonging for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, or UASCs, in the East England region. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about who UASCs are, what belonging means, and how I perceive educational spaces. So to give a little background on the asylum claiming process in the UK, there's a long process and it can take many different paths, but essentially when seeking asylum, there's a really intense screening interview that individuals will undergo. They'll meet with different government officials, there will be a decision made, and at the end of the process, they're either asked to leave through different systems based on what country they're from, or they are given refugee status, humanitarian protection, or discretionary leave. So that's the general asylum seeking process here. Unaccompanied asylum seeking children, or UASCs, are looked after children in the UK who are under immigration control. As looked after children, they can receive education up until the age of 25, and these young people are individuals who are below the age of 18 seeking asylum without a parent or guardian. There's been some debate about the term UASC itself because sometimes they are accompanied by an agent or trafficker, so there's been a push in some countries to call them separated children instead, but in England it's referred to as UASCs, and they don't know their legal status. They go through the asylum seeking process I just mentioned, doing it all as minors. So when they enter the UK, these young people often come through ports or enter on the backs of lorries, things of that nature, and they're sent to the Home Office where they undergo really difficult screening interviews. In some of the interviews I did to conduct my research, I talked to a legal expert who had done quite a bit of work related to the screening interview process and what really went on there in the early to mid 2000s. And he talked a lot about when these kids were first getting out of the ports or whatnot, they often would be in extreme physical pain from their journey, but they would still be asked to sit and undertake a screening interview. He gave examples of kids with broken wrists, for example, who were asked if they felt fit to do the screening, and they would say, "No, I'm hurting, I can't," and then they would be checked off as fit for screening, and they would go through the process, which could take several hours to a full day. They also, at first, would not have legal representation at these screening interviews. Fortunately, there have been pushes by the Home Office for changes over time for the screening interview process. However, there's still a long way to go. And one of the big issues in the screening interview process is age assessments. So what really separates the UASCs from other asylum seekers in the UK is their precarious double vulnerability as both children and asylum seekers. If these kids are below 16, then they're going to be placed in typically foster care situations, which means they get more one-on-one support, and they have an individual who, when they go home at the end of the day, knows they got there, can ask them how their day was, can check in, can talk to a social worker if they notice issues, things of that nature. However, if they are 16 or up, they're going to be placed in an independent care situation, which means they have a key worker assigned to them who might check in with them once a week in this hostel-like environment, sometimes more, sometimes less, but the requirements for a key worker are much less stringent than a foster carer. Understandably, that is a lot cheaper for local authorities, so they often, if they see a young person, it has often occurred that individuals will state the age they claim to be. So for example, if a young person states that they're 15, they'll be told by the Home Office employee who's undertaking the screening interview, you say you're 15, I'm going to say you're 16, because then that way they can save a lot of money by putting them in a different care situation. That decision carries with them. That means they get one less year in education. It means that they get less individual attention when they start out in the UK, all of this. So the age assessment process is really difficult. There's not a science to it. Laws have changed so that now if there is an age dispute, there can be a legal process for social workers to go through a system and try to prove that a young person is the age they claim to be. But it's, like I said, there's no science to proving someone's age, and there have been aggrandized rare occurrences in the media of, for example, in Ipswich in, I believe, 2018, a 30-year-old man was in a secondary school because he was claiming to be younger than he was, and that kind of aggrandized rare occurrence is what really sparks people's attention, and people start having concerns about these people lying about their age, which has created what the House of Lords and other scholars in the field have referred to as a culture of disbelief for these children. So the age assessment process is really key. After that, they go through a child in need assessment where what kinds of support they need is really looked at. Then they're assigned a social worker and they're placed in school or college. That's another place where age plays a really key role, because if they're under 16, they're placed in a traditional school. But young people 16 and up are actually placed in a vocational college, which puts them in largely segregated by language classes, as they're in ESOL classes to learn English, and they're going to be placed in classes based on their English ability. So if they're entering for the first time, they're typically going to be surrounded by other foreigners or UASCs. For the purpose of my research and looking at belonging in educational spaces, I see both formal and informal educational spaces as incredibly important to a young person's understanding of British culture, Western culture, etc. So it's not just looking at the formal spaces like schools and colleges, but also really trying to understand what they learn in foster care, in the independent hostels, in their doctor's appointments, in all of the different spaces they're inhabiting, because in each of those interactions, they're going to be learning more about how they are perceived by members of the British public and how they should be perceiving the world around them in this new cultural environment. So in terms of my methodologies, I already mentioned I did some interviews. Interviews were with those I identified as key practitioners working with UASCs. I took a constructivist approach, so the idea that each of the individuals I interviewed had their own opinion, their own biases, shaped by their personal experiences with UASCs. And while from these opinions I cannot extrapolate and say that everyone has the same social reality that these individuals have constructed, I do believe there can be transferable resonance in which what these practitioners interviewed discuss as being important in their interactions with creating a sense of belonging for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. Other practitioners can also learn from these lessons that the aforementioned interviewees learned from, and I also think that those who just engage with migrant youth on the scale of listening to perhaps problematic news coverage about these young people really can learn from these practitioners and what they see as facilitating a sense of belonging for the young people. So I mentioned that UASCs are looked after children in the UK system. In my interviews, it was very much coming up that typically when these UASCs enter, foster carers and social workers are often really hesitant to take on these cases, the UASC cases, compared to other looked after children. Typically, UASCs have lower expectations in the UK by the general public. However, at the same time, individuals who did interact with these young people quickly discussed that their opinions changed, that these young people compared to Indigenous looked after children really wanted to make the most of their school experience. They wanted to do all the right things because they knew it could affect whether or not they receive asylum status to stay and do what they felt was right for their family by being here. Supporting education for UASCs in the UK for young people in general is a human right. It's enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and this quote, which discusses education in directing to the development of the child's personality, talents, mental and physical abilities, really points to the idea that education is holistic. It's like this idea that all of these spaces affect a young person's education. It's in an educational space, something where you don't just need to think about how to help the child with educational attainment. You need to recognize that their past trauma, the current mental health issues they might carry, the other things on their mind, their other talents and abilities, that all comes into how they're going to focus in a classroom and have educational attainment. So it's really important for practitioners working with UASCs to recognize the holistic nature of education and the way that the different informal spaces they inhabit play a role in their sense of belonging in the actual classroom space. There are, of course, many limits to UASC's educational experiences. So on a systemic level, there's not been a single region in the UK that has succeeded in placing all UASCs who enter in schools or colleges within the statutory guidance of 20 days after they arrive. So not a single region has succeeded in that on a systemic level. On a contextual level, different regions or different areas in the UK are going to have different resources for different cultural groups. So for example, young people coming in all really are interested, if they're from Eritrea, in being typically near London because that's where the big Eritrean church is. And on a contextual level, it becomes quite difficult if through what's called the National Transfer Scheme, they're transferred out of London to a smaller area that has less UASCs, and they cannot reach the church that matches with their cultural heritage. That's going to be a distraction for them on school days if a major holiday is coming up because they want to find a way to get the money to get to these spaces. And on a more individual level, these kids carry with them a ton of really difficult memories. In conversations I've had with young people I've volunteered with, the stories that I have heard about their times in refugee camps and things prior to reaching their asylum seeker status, it can be really harrowing, and they're just trying to go through their day-to-day life, but these things are always going to be in the backs of their heads. So there's that, and then also with the age assessment idea, these young people could be matched to a different age. They could have special needs that aren't considered and aren't recognized in their child and need assessment, all sorts of different things that could really make school a troubling space for them. So I've talked a bit about the past trauma. One thing with that is a lot of schools in the UK and in the East England region in particular are making a move to become trauma-informed schools if they don't already have that training. But it's really important for these schools to also recognize that it's not just teachers who need to be trauma-informed. In interviews, there was one example I heard of a cafeteria worker who yelled at a student, and it triggered the student back to a really painful memory about yelling going on when their home was being burned down before they escaped. So there are all these things where workers who are interacting with them who don't have this training can still play a role. So it's not just the classroom space that matters, even informal institutions, but it's everything surrounding them as well. And also language barriers are a big issue in trying to have a sense of belonging in classroom spaces or non-classroom spaces because they're still learning, and after a long day at school, young people might want to take a break and be able to just relax in their home language, but typically they're going to need to continue in their home space if they want to have a relationship with their key workers or foster carers, pushing through and trying to speak English, which can be really difficult. In terms of how people in the UK and in the East England region specifically perceive UASCs, I mentioned earlier this culture of disbelief. There's been a major shift in the past few decades about how asylum is understood. There has been a bigger push to understanding a need for intense scrutiny and surveillance for these young people, and they very much feel that as non-citizens. There's even isolation within the welfare state. I very much in my research am looking at belonging for these young people. I build a lot on Nina Yuval Davis's theorization of belonging, and I like this quote that Yuval Davis posits, that belonging is about emotional attachment, it's about feeling at home, it is about feeling safe in a new community. So for these young people, they're at the really difficult psychosocial development stage of adolescence. They're navigating this difficult stage without a community, without parents or guardians, and the potential that schools and these other informal educational spaces provide for adult figures who can guide them is huge. So Yuval Davis discusses 3 layers of belonging. There are social locations, which can be understood both as the physical spaces that these young people inhabit, so the classroom space, the lunchroom space, the foster care home space, all of the different places, but also the identity layers, so sex, gender, race, ethnicity, etc. Then there's also individuals' identifications and emotional attachments to the different groups, so their relationships with teachers, their relationships with peers, Indigenous peers, UASC peers, etc. And there are the ethical and political value systems by which they judge others and are judged by others. So they can have multiple belongings, they can have attachments to different groups, and it's really important to remember that all of these things are very intersectional. They compound on one another, so a UASC sense of belonging is not going to be determined by just one of these factors. Some may play a role more than others, and because of the way social locations work, they may feel that some of their identity layers are stronger in some social areas than others, but all of it is just very intersectional. Schools very much reproduce what is the politics of belonging. So schools represent the cultural world around them, and in the UK, as a theorist Bauman discusses, there's very much a politics of belonging in which the social majority either forcibly assimilates the young people through what's called the anthropogenic, or they totally exclude through the anthropoemic ways of accepting these young people into new spaces. And in my research, it was very much apparent that there needs to be a balance through having some forms of positive assimilation, which I'll touch on later, but being careful not to exclude totally these young people from these spaces. They need to be accepted and included if they want educational attainment. So it's very clear that the UK government has a responsibility to support these young people, both on an international law scale and a national scale. The right to education means little if these kids aren't included in the classroom space, and schools have, as I said earlier, the potential to really provide reliable community networks and support these young people through this difficult stage they're going through. My interviews really indicated that cultural exchange, as one interviewee discussed, is a two-way street. So it's the idea that practitioners working with these UASCs need to both try to understand the young person's culture in order to make them feel included in the classroom, and also to teach them about Western culture. Schools in the East England region that have done really well with this are schools that already had really diverse populations at first. So for example, even if they didn't have Muslim students previously, they were willing to accept the idea that they needed to, once a new Muslim student entered, find a space where the student could go and have prayer time during the day. In schools that were more white, British, homogeneous, they were less likely to be keen on these ideas of making a more diverse space, but there's been a push in these areas by different government groups to do so. And in terms of teaching these young people about Western culture, this is where I get into what I was saying earlier about positive assimilation. So Ofsted has dictated that schools need to teach fundamental British values, and there were some comical anecdotes in some of the interviews I did regarding what fundamental British values looked like to some individuals previously. Practitioners talked about definitely having peer teachers and people like that who thought teaching fundamental British values was like, oh, you're in the UK, you have to drink tea now, that kind of thing. But what most of the practitioners were really stressing was that fundamental British values means teaching these young people about equality. So for many of these UASCs, if they come from a country where girls are not included in the classroom space and women don't have leadership positions, I spoke with one ESOL teacher who talked about her status as a woman and teaching these young boys in her classroom, these teenage boys, that as a woman in the UK, you have the option to work in a profession, and she chose to have the leadership role of teacher, and she spoke very highly of how much they accepted this role, which was very nice to hear. And I talked to some individuals who talked about working with girl children who were learning that they have a right to education and they have a right to have the same qualifications as the young boys in the same space as them. And there was interesting discussion around how some girls do feel guilt about that. It's something they need to overcome. So it's another case of really needing to have this two-way street of not just saying, I'm going to learn about your culture, but also saying, here's what I can teach you positively about mine, about how all of these different cultures have a place in what is a very multicultural UK now. So it's not just those British values of drinking tea. This is what it really means. It's also really important for practitioners in facilitating a sense of belonging for UASCs to recognize the politics of childhood and its intersection with the politics of belonging. International law dictates that these young people need to be looked at as children first. They're doubly vulnerable, but as I mentioned earlier, a lot of rhetoric focuses on those rare cases where it's a 30-year-old man in this educational space. That doesn't happen often, but it has prompted, as interviewees discussed with me, concern in the general public with this culture of disbelief that people are lying about their age, or people will discuss in the media often these children as what one scholar calls unchildlike children. So they're looking at them, referring to them as young men, young women, adolescents, forgetting the fact that as people under 18, they're children first and foremost. They need to be treated that way. And practitioners, when working with these kids, really need to focus on the fact that they've been through a crazy amount and they might have to act older because of it. But at the end of the day, they're still children and need to be treated as such. I think this interviewee, who was a social worker who then became a policy strategist for UASCs in East England, really sums it up well. education is holistic. Every space these kids inhabit once they enter the UK is going to teach them more about who they can be in the UK, who they want to be, what kind of person they will be if they are given citizenship, as well as how to have a sense of resilience if, like 48% of the UASCs in 2018, they are not given asylum status immediately. Now, many of those young people will appeal and get it later, but if they are forced to leave their home country, they still need to have a sense of resilience and have learned from their time here to be successful later on. So either way, it's so important that they have a sense of belonging so that they can have success later. Thank you.